Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. This is my series on the classes of Legion. I pitched this idea back in 7.1 and people loved it, but with 7.2 and flying, now really is the time to get cracking on it. These will be looks at each class in the game to basically find out if they're fun. The last time I played every spec in the game was during the beta for Legion, and we've got so many more stats and even a few class changes now, so it's totally worth taking another look. Patch 7.2 makes the endgame catch-up and the leveling process much faster, so it really is the perfect time to get started with this. Now, these are not class guides. Icy Veins is probably your best place to go there, and I know that Preach is looking to do a full class of every spec for his guide video series when patch 7.2.5 drops, so be on the lookout for that. We're going to kick it off with the class that I've mained throughout this expansion, the Hunter. With the Warlords of Draenor revamp that was planned pretty much being pushed back to Legion, how does this class fare? How have its three specs turned out? Is the class content good? And most importantly, is it actually fun? Alright, gameplay first. Marksmanship is the most commonly played hunter spec in Legion. Its combination of strong movement, especially with the meme spec, which I'll get onto later, and the lack of pet AI getting in the way, has meant that it overall has been a very strong contender. It generally puts out very competitive damage in just about every scenario, especially in some AoE where you really can do quite well indeed. It feels quite well rounded to play, and there's basically nothing that will be a major problem to you. Survivability is better than you'd think on a hunter. We get a self-heal with a cooldown that reduces whenever we kill mobs. We've got Feign Death, and we also have Aspect of the Turtle to get out of bad situations, and Turtle even gives you a solid heal with your artifact, which is pretty handy. The movement toolkit is also quite strong. You'll be able to get out of falling damage and travel quite fast with Disengage and Aspect of the Cheetah. Thankfully, they decided to give all hunter specs traps again, so you'll have access to those, plus a solid array of talents that really do make you feel very well-rounded and capable overall. The gameplay of this spec is quite strange though. Basically, your auto shots have a significant chance to proc marking targets. This means that your next multi-shot or aimed shot will apply a mark to your target. That will then let you use Marked Shot on that target, and Marked Shot applies a debuff called Vulnerable. Now, the thing about Vulnerable is that it significantly increases the damage that that target will receive from an aimed shot, so the overall gameplay flow surrounds, basically, marking your target, getting the Vulnerable debuff on your target, and then using as many aimed shots on that target as you can, benefiting from that Vulnerable debuff. Now that said, when you use the meme spec, i.e. adding in Piercing Shot, which consumes up to 100 focus to do massive damage, and then Explosive Shot, which sends off a rocket that you need to manually explode, much of the kind of clunk ends up being removed. You do become very mobile, and you're able to deal with most situations. Both these spells are on sort of longer cooldowns, so the short-term planning involved in using those well is quite fun indeed, and really is something that can set apart a bad MM hunter from a good MM hunter. AoE is an absolute blast with this spec. Multi-shot marks loads of different targets, meaning when you use Mark Shot, your character is pretty much a machine gun. It's pretty cool and fun to play. Combine that with Explosive Shot and then getting massive damage from Piercing Shot, it really is a whole lot of fun to play. Overall, this spec, it doesn't always flow that well all of the time, but when it does flow well, it's quite satisfying to play. It's definitely nice when you can perfectly squeeze out the 2 or 3 aim shots into a 6-second vulnerable window, and there is skill involved in ensuring that that happens often. Players who don't think ahead much are definitely punished by the spec, though I do think it's one of those cases, like with almost every DPS spec in World of Warcraft, where overall it's very easy to learn how to play optimally. Past the point, it's more about playing to the strengths of your legendaries, your set pieces, and the scenario that you're in than just the basic class mechanics. I do think that you feel very powerful as an MM hunter. You've got great movement, a lot of utility with your talents, and excellent DPS if you play right. Your toolkit pretty much just has an answer for everything. Then patch 7.2 did a great job of updating the animations for this spec. While it mightn't hold a candle to a Frost Death Knight, they have done a great job of making it look visually quite satisfying indeed. Alright, on to Beast Mastery. It's a strange spec in Legion. It doesn't score that highly for me overall, as there aren't really that many interesting decisions to make with it. Now that said, if you want to use a pet, this is the route to go. It certainly is cool having an army of beasts at your command, and it's also really convenient having this big meaty pet to tank targets for you. The gameplay, as it really has been for a few years, does surround your main damaging ability, Kill Command, and using that during your main buff, Bestial Wrath. The spec always used to be about getting, 2 uses of Kill Command during one Bestial Wrath window, and then perhaps maintaining Beast Cleave if you're in AoE. Beast Cleave is pretty simple. Basically, whenever you would do a multi-shot, your pet would start to cleave for a few seconds, and back in Warlords that meant insane AoE DPS. Now, the status quo largely continues in Legion, but with some additions. Dire Beast calls in pets to your aid, and it now decreases the cooldown of Bestial Wrath. Now, this does create some more interplay between the abilities, which is definitely welcome, as overall you're still trying to get as many Bestial Wrath kill commands as you possibly can. This all can be quite fun in theory, but it does run into the issue of the gameplay kind of being a little bit boring, at least for myself. It's generally just a case of you just kind of press the right button without a great deal of thought. It's also one of those specs where it ends up having a little bit too much downtime for my liking. You're only supposed to use your Cobra Shot, which is your main spender, if you otherwise would be capping focus. And I generally don't enjoy specs that have a lot of downtime, so it ends up not being super engaging for me overall. Now that said, it's an easy to play spec in the overall scheme of things. I guess it just doesn't have that fun factor for me. While having a pet is cool, the disconnect between your inputs and then the source of the damage can sometimes not really be that satisfying when you take into account the strong kinetic feel of many of Legion's updated specs from an animation perspective. And let's move on to survival. This was a controversial one for hunters. Blizzard always liked the idea of a melee hunter fantasy, and they kind of sold this to us as a vanilla WoW throwback. In reality, hunters really, if you used melee in vanilla, you were probably doing it wrong in a lot of cases. Plus, it was more that we just had some melee in our toolkit and less that it was a full melee spec that everyone played. Survival had to deal with, in Legion, having a proportionately low player count in comparison to the other specs, which is something that, I think it becomes apparent why when you actually play it. So it's entirely based off a mechanic called Mongoose Bite. This is an ability that has 3 charges and it will recharge over time. It then applies a buff that will make subsequent Mongoose Bites do 50% more damage, stacking up to 6 times. The duration does not increase or reset with each stack though. Therefore, the spec is a mad dash to cram in as many Mongoose Bites into that buff window as you can. Now, in addition to your normal recharge that happens just like a cooldown, you can proc fresh charges off your attacks, off ticks of the Bleed Lacerate, similar to maybe say like a Rend. There's also talents like Snake Hunter, which immediately give you charges. This overall gameplay loop is then completed with, Eagle's Fury. It's from your artifact weapon, it's that ability. Basically, it's Fist of Fury, but it does more damage based off the current stats, or the current stacks of Mongoose Bite's buff. It's got a 45-second cooldown, so basically the whole spec is that every 45 seconds you want to ramp up to having a 6-stack Mongoose Bite that's finished off with Fury, or Eagle Fury. This works, this feels great when it works right, and it's a big burst of damage when it does, but clunk is the word of the day here. The class's gameplay has a lot of really rigid timings that really, you have to make work in order to succeed. Small, sort of non-decision-based mistakes, or even a bit of lag, can cause knock-on effects that last for quite a while and throw off the rhythm of the spec. Now, the rhythm of the gameplay generally is kind of strange when you take all of the talents into account. This is one of those classes where the synergy between the core rotation and many of the talents and abilities just isn't really there in practice. You end up with this bloated number of abilities that really, most of them aren't that interesting, and they don't have the best synergy with the core gameplay mechanic of the spec. Now, some of you may have noticed how much RNG there is in this rotation. Sometimes you don't get a proc, and therefore you miss out on getting the ideal usage of your abilities. Now, it is true that this averages out over time, but moment to moment, it is a system that does cause quite a bit of frustration from time to time if you're really wanting to play it seriously. it also doesn't feel great when placed into the live game. It's one of those specs that's perhaps engaging when you're on a target dummy, but is less fun to play when you're thrown into a real-world scenario where you have other, often more fun mechanics in, say, boss fights to deal with. Really, it's one of those specs where everything just feels twice as fiddly as it would in another spec. Really, I think that they should take the core idea of the Mongoose Bite window, modify it, and then better design the other mechanics to fit around that. It feels like this spec was honestly kind of half-designed and then they just hastily filled in the rest. There are good ideas here, but I think more thought and polish are needed. Now, as a quick addendum to the Survival Hunter section of the video, I do want to mention that the gameplay feel of this spec, it really does improve to a tremendous degree as your gear improves. It's very much one of those specs, maybe like, say, a Fire Mage when it has low crit, where the gameplay pace and the overall level of fun is a lot lower at lower gear levels, and you're also more dependent on RNG at lower gear levels because the amount of, well, in this case, the amount of Mongoose Bite procs that you get is a little bit less reliable. So as you get things like your tier 19 2-piece or perhaps 4-piece, the reliability and uptime of your Mongoose Bites is greatly increased, and this does mean that you can have a lot more fun playing the spec. I would definitely say that this is not a fun spec to play for quite a while, but as soon as you especially increase your mastery a lot, remember that my hunter, of course, was already sort of optimized for to be a marksmanship hunter, which heavily relies on mastery. Therefore, I had a lot of the hunting companion mastery when I hopped over to survival. So with all of that, survival is a hell of a lot more fun. It's just one of those specs right now where it has that inherent flaw of not being fun without good gear. But when you do get good gear, yeah, it's actually significantly better than perhaps its first impressions might leave you thinking. And to a degree, this is something that applies to the other hunter specs in terms of getting legendaries and tier bonuses and how they affect the gameplay, but I think it really does affect survival more than the other two specs. Okay, let's talk about class fantasy. I think this is a major part of enjoying a class, and I don't mean that in terms of RP or anything like that, more that it's just satisfying. Look at the Elemental Shaman artifact ability for a prime example. You know, it's just really sort of fun, satisfying, and good to use. I don't think that hunters really fulfill the class fantasy much with their gameplay. Blizzard have never really been able to get around the problem of pets not feeling great to use because of their AI, and then the pets also just boil down to being another rotational button. I think that they should try designing abilities that give you a bit more synergy with your pet. Having different pet species have different interactions with your character would be cool. How about, say, you know, maybe a wolf or a cat having a charge attack where you would ride the pet, or maybe a movement ability that involves your eagle lifting you? I think things in sort of around those lines would be a good area to focus on for innovating with the hunter class. Marksmanship does meet its fantasy decently, it's just a more pedestrian concept anyway. Visually though, they are mostly on point. Alright, with gameplay covered, let's talk about the class content for the hunter. Unfortunately, it's among the worst in the game. Most of the other classes are a lot better, so I can't particularly recommend playing the hunter from a lore perspective. From what I've played and watched on Nobble's channel, most of the other Order Hall campaigns beat this one handily. Now, I empathize with Blizzard. Death Knights get to work for the Lich King, but hunters just have a more grounded, kind of more boring story that's less significant to the overall lore. Now, on the plus side, our Order Hall is very nice, so that's good, but unfortunately the quest content just doesn't hold a candle to most of the other classes. Okay, tier sets. I've always had a mixed feeling towards many of the hunter sets, but thankfully Blizzard have outdone themselves with most of the Legion hunter gear, at least for tier 19. We finally have a set that looks like proper armor. I wasn't always the largest fan of us just kind of wearing the corpses of things that we killed. As much as it was thematic, they did take it to a silly looking extreme. You didn't just kill something and, you know, work its pelt into your gear. No, you wore its head as a head, you wore its rib cage as a breastplate. It was a bit bizarre. Now, the other sets in Legion I think look great too, especially the sort of purple one. The Class Order Hall set is, of course, a recolor of the Mop Challenge Mode gear, which once again looks great. The Tier 20 set's not really my cup of tea, but it's a solid remake of Tier 6, if that is what you're into. Okay, pains and gains. This is a section where I just sort of want to talk about a little bit more of the feel of the class. not really that many sort of pains with this. Bar some clunk in a few of the specs, you definitely feel very capable in every situation. Ninja pulling things accidentally due to Barrage behaving badly in 7.0 was more of a problem, but that has since been fixed. Gearing, really, one sort of pain point I suppose is that for an MM hunter it really relies on mastery, which can be a bit of a drag, as any gear without that does feel quite terrible in comparison. I do wish they were able to better balance the secondary stats in the game. There are also one or two trinkets or legendaries that really feel required to do extra well. As a marksmanship hunter, having Ullr's snowshoes and the Convergence of Fate is really important. I've got neither of them currently, but I've used them both on the PTR through the gear vendor, and you know, that reliance is kind of unfortunate because you definitely do feel weak without them. Overall though, I don't have that many major overarching complaints, and certainly being super powerful in just about every situation, yeah, it's kind of fun. Okay, moving forward. I think that hunters are not in a brilliant position overall. I have big problems with two of their specs, and marksmanship could certainly be polished up. Currently, MM is the better performing spec, and I think it's one that you can do very, very well with. The worry is that if BM or SV became the most viable option from a damage perspective, then some people might force into playing a spec that they don't really like. I think Blizzard need to take a fundamental look at how survival plays, and then make some pretty large changes to beast mastery, and maybe think about how they could do some polishing to marksmanship. Until then, it seems like Blizzard are happy to maintain the status quo by balancing marksmanship to be just ahead of the others as far as the main spec, and still keeping BM being viable for those who like it. I do hear that SV is actually quite fun in PvP, but I can't really speak to that past a few battlegrounds. So that is it for this video. A hell of a lot of fun to do, and I cannot wait to get going with the other classes. These do take a pretty crazy amount of time with all of the research that ends up needing to be done, and it's only really possible because of the support of the people over on Patreon. They've allowed me to hire on a friend of mine, actually, to help edit the videos, which has meant that I can spend more time working on long-form content like this. Anyway, guys, that's it for this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.